The opposite of a philosopher. You know the Taoists are funny too, yes? Confucians tend to be more serious on balance, and I think Buddhists have great humor also at times, but are also pretty serious people. That's why we can hold them up to a higher standard than I do, because they're serious, okay? Taoists are very serious, but also very funny. They have to be. It's yin and yang. They have to be. So I'll give you an illustration. What's the opposite of a philosopher? Any ideas? Anybody volunteer? I have an answer. I don't think there's one answer. But it's a curious question, is it not? What's the opposite of a philosopher? Well, think about this, okay? Nietzsche said, I'll give you a hint and then I'll tell you. Nietzsche said, quote, happy people have no history. Right? You know this quote, yeah? If you have too much history, you're probably very unhappy. Okay, especially if you dwell on it and dwell on the grievances and dwell on the wrongs and instead of looking forward to make right and just things happen, you're going to dwell too much on the past. You're going to be unhappy for sure. There's a remedy here. The Taoists have it, of course. Get rid of your history and you'll be happy. But isn't that a contradiction? I mean, China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, so it has a huge history. So Chinese people should be very unhappy, according to Nietzsche, but they're not. So they must have some secret. Okay? Okay, here's a little bit of it, coming from a Western perspective. What's the opposite of a philosopher? Recently, at a dinner party, I was introduced to a guest named Robert. He was quite well known and also well regarded, especially by many people with too much history. But as I am someone with not enough history, I had not heard of him. But he had heard of me. When I inquired, what do you do? Robert said, I'm the opposite of you. Well, that sounded quite intriguing. So I asked him, what's the opposite of a philosopher? He said, a journalist. Okay, journalist. All right. We both laughed aloud. But actually, it's not a laughing matter. Robert writes a well-known column for a famous newspaper that I hardly ever read. Why not? Because, as he says, journalism is the opposite of philosophy. Well, what does that mean? Well, philosophy means love of wisdom, right? I mean, it's a literal meaning of it. So the opposite of a philosopher might be someone who hates wisdom, right? A hater of wisdom or a lover of folly would be one way of being the opposite of a philosopher. But Robert didn't seem hateful. He wasn't a hateful person. Perhaps he then was a lover of folly. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, philosophers write texts that often endure for centuries or even millennia, like Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, yes? It's endured they're read and reread, studied again and again. By contrast, most journalists write texts that endure for the day they are printed, at least when there was only hard copy, and then discarded and forgotten as if they had never existed. Many people collect old books. Most people throw away old newspapers. That's an opposite of philosophy, to be sure. Then again, many journalists have huge readerships, right? Millions read their columns, which take perhaps a few hours or days to write. By contrast, many philosophers are lucky to sell 10 copies of their latest book, right? And their mother buys 9 of them, you know. A book which possibly took them many years to write. So there's another opposite of philosophy, to be sure. Robert had an inquiring mind, and I believe he intended something quite different as an opposite to philosophy. The world's greatest philosophers, including Lao Tzu, Buddha, and Socrates, were all serene. Loving wisdom in the right way cannot fail to induce happiness. And so these lovers of wisdom made many other people happy too. Journalism is different. Why? Because the cardinal rule that governs mass media is bad news sells more than good news. Media moguls know this, so do their editors and journalists, and so do the consumers themselves. You know the apocryphal tale about William Randolph Hearst? You know the story, founder of the Hearst Corporation. He was quite a notorious character, interesting guy. He once sent a commercial sketch artist in the days before commercial photography to Cuba to cover the Spanish-American War. And when the artist arrived, he found no war. He had nothing to sketch. So he sent a telegram to Hearst to that effect. And Hearst replied, this is the apocryphal telegram from Hearst, "You furnish pictures, I will furnish war." So unfortunately, And those of us who are engaged in peace and in peace process and in peace activism, as many are in this room, know that war sells newspapers more than peace. But that peace promotes much more happiness than war. So there's a contradiction, there's a disconnect in a way. And Robert, too, was covering bad news in his columns, which made great headlines and also made people unhappy. I'm covering timeless ideas. No headlines. Do make people happy. And maybe that's what Robert meant when he called us opposites. And the question still remains, why does bad news sell more than good news? And the Taoists have an answer to that too. But it requires that people become more mindful of things that the Tao stands for in order to be more at peace with themselves. I firmly believe, I've come to believe, all these years. Do you know I'm in my 64th year, and Moshe, my composer friend, said, you know, you brought this book out in a really good year because this is your 63, you're in your 64th year, that's 1 year for every hexagram in the I Ching. So I've, in this body, I've had, a year for every hexagram. That's a good thing. I've completed the cycle. And I've come to believe, and maybe my Buddhist friends will agree, that most of the conflict in the world is a result of inner conflict. The people who cause the conflicts and perpetuate the conflicts are themselves conflicted. And if we can help them to resolve their inner conflicts, then the outer conflicts will cease. I really believe this, and this is the work, really, to resolve the inner stuff. You can't impose peace on people. They have to impose it on themselves. This is the art. Okay, so that's the opposite of a philosopher.